So just for one moment to say thank you so much for all of you elaborating the exact premise that I thought we would explore through the evening, and that is by repeating your own experience first experiences in Shanghai. You've illuminated all of the issues that have transpired in this 20 years or so in establishing a process, in finding financing, in the mechanics of working there, the lack of contractual structures, up to a very sophisticated environment now in which global practice of planning and architecture is carried out. So I know Bob's going to help us to understand more of that, but thank you all for leading us through what really is the history of the Shanghai skyline in only about 20 years of experience.
Thanks, Carol. And I just made a few notes as we were sitting there, and she outlined a number of the themes and concerns or issues that I heard raised. Everything from a bad economy that led an architect there. Well, we're in a bad economy right now. And working with the large institutes, the role of sustainability, the role of history, and its relationship to contemporary design, if any, financing, and the client base, which is critical anywhere, but what is it there? Acquiring work, which is central to doing work, and for instance, the role of competitions, that was mentioned several times. And finally, a question about the buildings themselves, the tectonics of the buildings, which has evolved from rather rudimentary to very sophisticated building systems now. And how has that changed? I'd love to hear about that. But let's start with just the context, because Shanghai originally was a low-scale city, and we saw images of Pudong, which was in some cases uninhabited, it seemed, or just in very rudimentary ways, and has since grown into this colossus. The city had these concessions, and parts of the city still retain this very authentic flavor. When we're talking about tall buildings, does the term context mean anything, or is that an international term? And specifically here in Shanghai, is there a context to respond to? I'd be interested in what you think you would be playing off. How would you position your design work to reflect what this place is? Does that mean anything? Or is it really more an international arena that could be in Dubai or anywhere else? Anybody?
Well, I was going to say, I think one of the things that amazed me the most about the Chinese was their total disregard for history and heritage, which wasn't just something that happened in the communist period and the Cultural Revolution, but I guess it manifested itself ultimately in the Cultural Revolution, when it basically wiped out any sense of culture and history and wealth, any connection to that. But it was, but each dynasty in history has just traditionally come in and torn down everything that had been built by its predecessor, and then built it back almost exactly the same way. And never trying to emulate it, never trying to change it or express new ideas. Very hung up in tradition that way. So we just found very little interest in, we kind of slipped in some parasol type of building tops and things like that. There was very little interest in that. They just wanted something new, different, Western, any sort of subtleties that you would try to propose. We like to be somewhat sophisticated in what we do. They just didn't get it. They didn't understand that because they couldn't understand, they couldn't appreciate the fact that we were trying to do something low-key when they wanted to be flashy.
It just wasn't a priority for them, though. I think that they care about it. Jack.
I agree with Bruce 100%. I think the last thing on their mind was any sort of historical reference. They wanted something new, they wanted something flashy, they wanted something that was going to prove that they had arrived. So if you were able to do it, it was because you insisted on it. No one really required, recommended that you do so. With Shanghai Center, because the street at that time only had 2-story buildings, we did a 2-story retail component that was scaled to match that street facade, and then lifted the building before we went high. And at that time, we went very high. At the time, it was 35 stories or 46 stories. And, we knew eventually if people would come beside us, and we would be in scale with, KPF buildings and others that were in the area. But today, as I was saying earlier, there's a much more interest in preserving old buildings in some of the historical past. But I still don't think there's much attention given to taking that sort of cultural influence, set of influence, and apply it to newer buildings.
Okay. I just because I agree for the time period, perhaps of those experiences, what you're saying. But I think that the answer to the question is changing rapidly. And it's changing selectively and very unevenly, as with probably any situation in culture where social, economic, educational norms are changing so profoundly. The best example, which many of you probably know, is Xintiandi, where the effect of one developer, Vincent Lowe, and a very clever appropriation of this first Communist Party Congress Hall has led to the kind of Williamsburgization of a district, and then hanging off a very carefully reconstructed 1920s piece of recession era Shanghai are some taller buildings. Now, those may not be, as we might see, the most sensitive of extrapolations of some kind of historical craftsmanly logic or a way of making architecture, but it's an attempt. And I think all over China, cities, governmental figures, developers, architects are thinking about Xintiandi. And those discussions are playing out again and again and again. And they may be sort of clumsy false starts, but I think, before it's too late, fortunately, Shanghai is deciding not to erase every Ilong housing patch. And many other cities are thinking the same way. We were just one last example. We've been struggling, good for the city and bad for us in a way, in Hangzhou, which is the great repository of Chinese urban landscape, let's say, to build a hotel for Robert Koch again. And the government has said 79 meters, no 60, no 50, no 40. Well, they progressively restricted the building down to nothing, and it won't be built, to preserve a view of a great series of mountains and lake forms and pagodas. And that's the kind of thing which I think is probably more determined than we are used to in some of our settings in the United States. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There are reasons, but I think it's becoming patriotic and cool to be historically sensitive now.
Let me ask you about, you mentioned Vincent Lowe. Clients make a tremendous difference, obviously, in what a project becomes. And in fact, their expectations, their programmatic demands, someone talked about how certain clients expect a certain base with a tower. I mean, there's certain preconceptions that clients bring to architectural solutions. What about the client base here? We know that much of the money that has funded some of these larger projects is Hong Kong money, but Jackie mentioned other consortia that have been put together. How do you see the people who literally commissioned many of these new great buildings affecting what we see?
Well, he who has the goal rules.
Yeah.
A good example in our case would be the Bund Center. The Bund Center is an office building. It's about 800,000 feet with a service department on one side and a hotel on the other. We had done an earlier scheme on a different site for this Chinese-Indonesian owner, and it had a crown sort of top. It was a very abstract crown. Well, the owner got in his mind a crown, and he, in the end, insisted on a liberal crown on top of that. Now, were we happy about that? Maybe not. But we did 44 different models of different crowns to try to illustrate how this might be done in a more, less burlesque way. And it didn't work. So we ended up had to build what he wanted to build. Now, as a developer, I don't have that problem, because in the end, I can make the decision of what is appropriate for the building. But when you're working for somebody else, you can be as persuasive, you can have all the right reasons, but if they have subjective reasons for doing otherwise, they'll do so.
And in fact, the crowns of the buildings in Shanghai are a show in of themselves. I mean, this is one of our world phenomena, is the cavalcade at night when the lights come on, and literally being able to point to and identify these amazing building tops all over the place. Other client stories that affected or formed your own projects?
We've tended to do work in Shanghai and in much of China, initially following the Hong Kong developers who invested enormously in China at the beginning, and then also the local market. But your story, Jack, pretty much reflects many situations where we've been in, and it's good and bad, because you get to a design solution quickly, because you don't have a committee of people, you have one guy that makes a decision, and whether or not that's Li Ka-shing or the Kwok family, you generally have a series of options. He'll get you to keep going, and then you go off and you build it. I think the longer process actually can often get you a better design solution, but it's very fast and pretty efficient.
Yeah, Bruce.
I was just going to tell a story about the a project we were doing in Handong. I think the city is called, in the Jiangxi province, which is southern and central. And it was to be a 68-story building on the People's Park, which was the ultimate symbol of commercialism. And on the opposite end of the park was the monument to the founding of the Communist Revolution, where Mao had started it. There was a big guy holding a rifle and the ultimate anti-capitalist symbol. So it was going to be interesting. It didn't get built, but one side note on this was we arrived and Fowle, the mechanical engineer, was there, and Vinny D. Simone was there, he's a structural engineer. And we were looking at the site, and we were all just so excited about this huge building. And the highest building in the city was maybe 30 stories at the most. And so we're all looking and dreaming, and Val there comes running up to me, all in a panic. He was just petrified. Bruce, we got a problem. There's no manholes. He couldn't find any services in the street, so he was having a bad day. But anyway, the real story was the feng shui, because this was a Macau client. Feng shui was okay. If you were in communist China, you couldn't have any superstitions. So we originally designed the tower in kind of a triangulated plan shape, with a big celebratory bowl on the top. And the client said, no, because they would not tell you directly that they don't like something. They always they find another way of expressing it. They don't want to hurt your feelings. And so he said, this is not good feng shui. Triangular, two angular, even though it wasn't really the right triangle. So we went back and showed him a round tower. He said, well, maybe feng shui a good idea. He says, it's his way of telling us he didn't like the round tower.
In popular writing in airline magazines, they always compare Shanghai to New York with the energy level and its sort of international population who've been attracted there over the last 100 years. But how real is that? How much of this is China? For instance, and I'm looking at this just from the architectural perspective, working there. You have to work with an institute to achieve your goals, do you not? And how lugubrious, how difficult, how impenetrable, how hard, or how easy is this place to work as compared to other parts of China or in other parts of Asia? What, is this more analogous to other international centers, or is this China? And if so, what differences does it make?
Well, again, I think, again, it's becoming, or has become almost, quite analogous to many international settings. In particular, the codes with which we all have to abide with. In particular for high-rise buildings, stiffness codes, codes governing the foundation, the behavior of foundations that David could tell you about. When we began Plaza 66, probably much more extremely so when Jeff began the Portland project, these codes were very malleable, and one could almost guess. And again, district by district, they would change. And if the fire marshal left and retired after a 2-year stint and someone else came in, the design could be rendered invalid in a very fundamental way. So there has been a kind of congealing of code and standards in a good way, so that we can predict, our partners, local design institutes, our clients can predict technically what's possible. And that is streamlined work, I believe, by a factor of 2, let's say, over what one would have expected. I think still, and this goes back a little bit to overlap with your question about the client world, the relationship, not just to the architect, to the government official, but even more so the client to the government official, is crucial in getting any project done. And these are relationships that are not about, for the greater majority, as far as any of us can tell, about exchange of money, but it's about the investment in long-term political relationships. So that to expeditiously complete a project, your owner will have to know someone very powerful in Beijing, who's invariably an ambitious project, does break through some of these fuzzy lines, zoning envelopes or whatever, and only after a lunch, just before Chinese New Year, or just before some other festival at the right time, everything that could take you months and months of testifying before experts will be settled with a meal and a handshake. So much is about human relationships at the highest level, and that's, those are the clients, and those are the horses we're riding, and that's what makes it possible for us to do our work. So we vet our clients before we take the projects, and we find out in what kind of standing they are, which isn't usually that hard to find out, because it's kind of a set of public relationships.
Can I add to that? I think that's going to your question about what the social aspects are. I think it's very much similar to New York. And I know from personal experience from my daughter who spent summer in Beijing, and she loved it because it was a party city. There was lots to do, there was lots of travel that she could do outside, and it is attracting young people who are mixing and meeting with other young people. And I think that's happening in Beijing, I think it's happening in Shanghai. And when you build 2,000 buildings in a city, you develop an expertise. And we've seen the beginnings of some of the companies from Beijing in particular going out across the world and doing some international competitions, international design. And that kind of makes our life a little bit easier, because as they go abroad, they start to want to work with international engineers and collaborate with international architects. And we're getting more on the same wavelength about how to actually implement things. And I think that goes on to Jamie's point about, is it impossible to work there? I think there are, your first project in China, I reckon you always lose money.
Well, let's
But
follow that.
certainly we did. It was a real learning experience.
Let's follow that a bit, because everybody showed unrealized projects. and I'm sure there's lost money, there are tails behind the tails. But is building in Shanghai in that sense more difficult? Is it corrupt? Are there issues behind the curtain to deal with? Are there questions that we don't have to face in other major international cities that we face? Or is it more transparent now? Is it, obviously there's this human relation question, but what about competitions? We hear people who are drawn into work and then the designs are taken and used and
All of the above.
all of that.
Everything you said, Rick.
Just let me give you a recent example. We entered a competition in Qingdao. It was a relatively small building by Chinese standards, so 6,000-7,000 feet. And 200 people, 200 architects from around were submitted. They narrowed it down to 16, and then they asked for just written proposals, requests for proposals, so you didn't have to do any work. They narrowed it down to 4, and they agreed to pay something like $50,000 or $70,000 to do a competition. And they gave you a list of deliverables. You did that, and then, well, they narrowed it down to 2, and you had to do more work. The 2 finalists had to do more work, which you weren't paid for. And then, in the end, luckily, we won, and so we won. Okay, we're okay. But since we've won, even before we've been able to sign a contract, we've done at least 20 more schemes to try to satisfy ambiguous requirements. Now, hopefully, that will materialize into a contract and we'll be okay. But if it doesn't, we'll have lost money, but not a great deal. Most competitions will pay something. They won't pay you enough to cover everything, but they'll at least pay you some.
Bruce is shaking his head. Sounds like a bitter experience here.
Yes. It was interesting for the ICBC project, which was the first project we did there, one of the first projects that was done in Pudong. So there was a learning curve on everybody's part, including how to write contracts, diagram of tax, and all these things we had to work our way through. But they, oops, I forget the thought. They actually had some vague rule that you had to have a competition. And they had already signed a contract with us. So when the planning board told us that, we then had to do our own in-house competition. And we came up with 3 different schemes to the same building. Made sure the one we wanted was the one that won. Everything was okay. But that was one of the better experiences.
Normally, they'll get 2 straw horses to do it, usually local firm, to participate in the competition with you. I mean, many times, when you enter into something like that, you do so knowing you're going to win. But I'd say that that's less than 25% of the time. Now, particularly with international competition being what it is, everybody's clawing for whatever work they can get. I mean, people who wouldn't even think about competing 2 years ago are in competitions as well.
What about, that brings us, you bring up the very question of the economy, which is where we started off. And Bruce, you were drawn there during a period of downtime in the rest of the world, and people were starting to kick off work in China. We're obviously in the pits here economically, and yet China's still growing at a rate now that's 7% or thereabouts. So there's work. And is this case holding true, or are the doors still being knocked on and international architects lining up to do the work of engineers that's being done? Are we maintaining our New York practices out of work that we're doing in China? We've heard some statistics among you all. But what sort of competition are you facing from other international players?
Everybody's there.
Everybody's there.
Everybody's there. Yeah, for us, I would say 60 to 70% of our work comes from China.
That heavily? Yeah. Okay. Anybody else have experience with this?
Well, I think that the economy in China has not been hit anywhere near like it has been hit here. So we've seen projects and architects increasingly going for work in China and have been supporting them in doing this. And the Chinese are still, they've, although you look at Shanghai and you think, well, wow, look at how many buildings they've built. They're just starting because they've got all the second-tier cities. And we're seeing a real boom in second-tier cities being targeted for redevelopment by some mega clients that are looking at 10 million square foot developments, 15 million square foot developments. Major, it's like building a new city town. And that is a very sort of a change in some of the way that the market is going. The projects keep getting bigger, even in the recession there's still some bigger projects happening.
So the world is going to China. We would normally be taking questions from the audience, but with our technological hiatus. Carol, is there anything you'd like to ask or add to this discussion?
Well, actually, I just want to thank you all so much for the scope of your experience.